about Fluxus that I think in a lot of ways makes it hard to talk about is that it's a little bit like Dada in that it can be about anything in some ways. It really broadens the category of art, or maybe not the category of art, the definition of art. That's a better way of putting it. One of the things that Martinez was interested in, and other Fluxus artists, was to draw attention to everyday things, so that, and you kind of get a sense of this in the manifesto, because he's being very critical of this sense that that art is about elitism, that there's this kind of cultural elite that controls art, and so there's this interest in trying to really kind of attack that in a sense, and that a lot of Fluxus, especially with Fluxus performances, sometimes to a less, sometimes yes and sometimes no. Again, it depends on the work that you're looking at and the artist. But even objects themselves are kind of denying, in a sense, that, or resisting. That's the word we're looking for. Is resisting the traditions of art, which is that art is created by skilled individuals, that art is something precious, art is object-based, art is something that we hang on a wall and put on a pedestal and stand back and look at it. So the Fluxus artists are trying to do something very differently. And again, there's a lot of similarities and a lot of correspondences. It's not Dada, because that's coming out of a different time period and a different cultural context. But it kind of shares a kind of a mood, in a sense, or a feeling similar to Dada. And Dada is certainly an inspiration for a lot of Fluxus artists as well. This is an early piece, kind of, you can think of it as a performative piece by Martinez called Piano Activities that was orchestrated in Wiesbaden, Germany, which is where he was working at the time, living and working. And I meant to look this up before class because he had kind of a straightforward sort of day job, and I'm trying to remember what it was. It was not anything of note, but he began, so he's got, a regular job to pay the bills, and it's around this time period that, and I think he was working as an engineer or something like that, and he begins to orchestrate these kind of Fluxus, happenings, or these Fluxus events. So Piano Activities was basically a group of individuals who were taking apart a piano, kind of deconstructing it. So and again, we just know it, from these documentary photographs. There's a piano that's present. There's a group of people. There's a whole range of tools, and so individually they decide what they're going to do. How are they going to use the tools? Are they going to use the tools or not? And the interesting thing about this, I think, is this dynamic of group of people, sort of main object, ancillary objects, put in a space and see what happens, right? So it's a kind of loose orchestration. But that kind of dynamic we'll see in other, Fluxus events and other Fluxus performances as well. Martinez also created work that in some ways crosses over with graphic design. But it has very political content as well, and that's something really to consider. The date of this piece here, today, if an artist were making something like this, it would probably be a vinyl work, or maybe an image, reproduced on the internet. So in some ways, I feel like this work is kind of fresh, or it seems familiar to us. But for this time frame, for the 1960s, mid-60s especially, it's really unusual. What he's done here is he's produced basically a poster, and if you look carefully, clearly it's representing the American flag. Instead of the blue field with stars, it has death's head, skull and crossbones. And then there's text that says, the USA surpasses all the genocide records. Kublai Khan massacres 10%, and Near East Spain massacres 10% of American Indians. Joseph Stalin massacres 5% of Russians. Nazis massacre is at 5% of occupied Europeans, and the list kind of goes on and on and on. And then at the very bottom, it says, for calculations and references, write to a P.O. box in New York City. So today you'd have a website, right, where you make all of this information available as to where you draw your statistics from. So part of the reason why I show you this image too is what he's done is he's created a graphic. And he's crossing boundaries in this respect of graphic design and art. So categories expanding and kind of crossing and becoming more permeable. The other thing, too, is that it's also important to see that within the context of the time in which there's growing politicization of culture, and especially of youth culture, and that's something that you see, kind of becoming more significant the closer you get to the end of the decades. There's a clash between generations, essentially, that's happening as well. As we look at this photograph, though, we're not just looking at a photograph of the work. What are we also looking at? Or who are we looking at?
John and Yoko.
Yeah, John and Yoko, right? So I think it's interesting. We still refer to them in that way, John, Lennon, and Yoko. When you see an image like this, though, I'm curious as to what does this evoke for you? Or maybe put it this way: when you think of John Lennon and Yoko, I don't know, what do you think of? What things come to mind? Yeah, I know. She's gonna, like, on her epitaph, it's gonna be, she's lit up the Beatles. It seems like her. It's stuck with her. I'm sorry, say again.
Her career was definitely the backburner to his, to the public eye.
Yeah, in a lot of respects.
Face presence.
Why are they standing in this photograph? Or standing in front of his work in this photo? Do you think? Yeah, celebrity support, right? So one of the things, when you think of John Lennon and Yoko, do you think about them as political activists at all, or do you think about them as musicians?
Oh,
So yes and no.
They became activists throughout. I mean,
Yeah.
With their bed in and
And we'll talk about this more specifically. But I was just curious with this image as to, when you see them in this image, like, kind of what that, sort of querying, to see what that evokes, because they do become, very, very, very politicized. Yoko Ono was and is, she's still alive, an artist. Lennon became interested in her because he saw one of her art projects and was really kind of, had a powerful experience with it, and then, wanted to talk to her, and essentially one thing led to another. But with this photograph, what they're doing is in 1966, they're both very well known. John Lennon, especially because of the fame, of the Beatles, Yoko, because of her connection to him. And what they're doing here in this photograph is basically lending their support to this. This is an image that would go out, would have gone out into the public, would have gone out into media because they were in it. And I think that's something worth considering. Is you've got artists, artists, celebrities, political, commentary, social commentary. All of these things become really intertwined, really kind of wrapped up or enmeshed, kind of with each other. And so I think this image is. I mean, we can talk about it in terms of what it's representing, but we can talk about it in a more complicated way as well as this image representing, some of the dynamics of a time frame. Matthias is probably best known for creating these arrangement of objects that are known as Flux Boxes. This is the Flux Yearbox 2 from 1967. And also, too, these are a little bit complicated because you can think of them or talk about them in a number of different ways. The way they worked, he produced several of them, is that he invited other artists to participate. So one of the things about this work is it's collaborative. It's not just one artist who, to be fair, I probably should list all the artists' names here, but it's about 8 or 9 different artists. It's not a work that's created by one single artist. And even in the 1960s, this was, pretty challenging idea because there's this idea, or there was this continuing, tradition or traditional thinking that art was made by the singular artist genius, right? The individual, who's the skilled person, the person who has the idea, and makes this independent work. What we'll see as we go through the 1960s and come forward, closer to our own time, is that working collaboratively is something that's happening more and more, and is getting more, certainly getting more attention, and becomes more acceptable across time. It's still, it depends on who you talk to. There's still some people who are a little uneasy with collaborative work. They want to know who did what, and who's maybe the more dominant, person in the collaboration. But even those attitudes, I think, have really changed, especially within the last few years as well. So with this, Machines, kind of essentially organizes a group of people. It has this box. The rules are essentially that you've got whatever object you make, it has to fit into the box. So what he's doing is he's creating a set of parameters that the work has to meet, and it's a whole host of things. Printed cards. There's a matchbook here with text on it. Or there's something else like a deck of cards. Things that are maybe more easily recognizable as art in some ways. There's also film, and this is some celluloid film that's kind of unspooled, so you can see that it's film. So what we think of today as media is video and computer-based art. New media for artists in this time frame, would have been film, and then by 1967, video was really just starting to, and which we'll also talk about separately, is really just starting to come into play as well. So you get this whole assemblage of things. And we'll talk about another artist who's also creating these box collections or these box sets. And when we see his work, and that's an artist named Brex, when we see his work, I'll show you another image, because both of these artists, by creating these assemblage or these objects that fit into a box that are essentially transportable, are also making reference to Duchamp and making references back to Dada itself. So again, I think with Fluxus, there are a lot of ideas that are in sync with Dada or kind of referencing Dada, although it's the dynamic of the time period and what the artists are trying to achieve is really different. In 1978, this is a very late work and really actually his last project. Machinis in the early 70s had been, or actually maybe just a couple of years before this was completed, actually, sometime really mid-70s. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and cancer of the liver, so it metastasized. In 1978, he married, I don't remember her name actually, he got married essentially. And so he died either in 1978 or in early 1979, but he essentially dies within the year of this project. And so essentially what he did is he, very late in his life, makes this decision to get married. But the wedding ceremony itself becomes a Fluxus performance. And essentially what they did as a part of the wedding ceremony, and these are three photographs that give you a sense of what happens. They're both wearing very formal dresses you expect at a wedding. He was wearing a tuxedo. His wife-to-be was wearing a formal gown. And through the course of the ceremony, they essentially undressed each other. They took off their clothes, and then they redressed each other in each other's clothing. So there was, and so there's something kind of romantic about that, which isn't an idea that's often associated with Fluxus. And what he was getting at was this concept of when two people get married, there's this kind of union or this kind of merging in a sense. So the unclothing and reclothing was a kind of demonstration of those ideas, again, which are pretty old ideas as well. So maybe there's a slight romantic strain to Fluxus, at least in this particular performance. One of the other artists who is really one of the key Fluxus artists was George Brecht. And Brecht is best known for creating these dynamics known as event scores. And this is where you can really see the influence of John Cage. And it's one of the reasons why last time I wanted to talk a little bit about Cage, because remember, one of the things that Cage was doing with music was basically kind of creating a set of parameters, composing music for prepared piano. So he's building in, he gives you a set of things that are going to happen or tells you how to set things up. But he's building in the kind of chance elements or kind of random elements. And the fact that Brecht calls these event scores is notable because when we think that term score is a term that's used in reference to music. So there's a musical score, you score music. The event refers to the fact that they're performances. These are all events that were intended to be performed in various places, in front of people or on the street in some cases. One of them was called Drip Music, and you see a documentary photograph of it. And in general, he produced these cards that are basically the equivalent of, say, a sheet of music for if you were thinking about music. And so drip music, or drip event as it's known, is for single or multiple performance. A source of dripping water and an empty vessel are arranged so that the water falls into the vessel. So those are the instructions, right? So that's the event score. And it can be open for interpretation. Do you do this in a performance hall? Do you do it on the street? Do you do it in a house, how many people are involved. So again, it's this very simple thing, and maybe a kind of common thing, in a strange sort of way. And you're having people, focus their attention on you doing something that's really outside of any other context. And so it's kind of, in some ways, it's kind of like Cage's 433 performance, where there's an element of absurdity to it, but what it does is it makes you really aware of the moment of time in which you're existing, essentially what's happening, what's around you, the sounds, and so on. So rather than being focused on listening to beautiful music or looking at a beautiful painting or sculpture, you're in the moment with a bunch of other people. And so I think that's maybe one of the better ways of thinking about how these things work. Here's a whole series of event scores, and they can be kind of perplexing. Like the concerto for clarinet, the direction is just nearby. How do you interpret that? And again, that's where that element of chance or randomness comes into play, because the person who's going to perform this piece, and they're talked about as being performed, has got to make some decisions. Some of the events are also take into the account of randomness, and they have a beginning and an end, and they're orchestrated in the sense to have a beginning and an end. But depending on when and how it's performed, it could, the length of it could really vary. So, for example, the event that's in the center here, 3 telephone events, and this wouldn't work so well today because of the way technology has changed. But you have to imagine in the past, you have telephones. They will ring, or they used to ring as a long, voicemail didn't exist, answering machines didn't exist at this point, and the phone is just going to ring as long as somebody's willing on the other end, is willing to let it ring. So the 3 telephone events is when a telephone rings, it is allowed to continue ringing until it stops. When the telephone rings, the receiver is lifted and then replaced, so basically hanging up instantly. And then the third part is when the telephone rings, it is answered, and then the performance is concluded. So again, a very open-ended kind of thing. It could take place anywhere, where there is a telephone. Now, Brecht also produced his event scores in a box, so they were collected together into this object, which was called, and again, it's just a kind of a nonsensical like water yam, arranged by George Brecht, which you can see on the text here. The other thing I should mention about Matthias that I didn't, one of the other reasons, this is the practical reason for creating the Fluxus boxes, is because they made Fluxus tangible. So they bring this element of the object into play, and they were also something that could be sold. And for Matthias, he lived, and I think that was referenced in the documentary, is that he was really, really poor at times in his life and really struggling to get by, but wanting to continue to make work. And so if he could take Fluxus, which was very loose, very open-ended, very difficult to objectify or create an object out of, by creating those boxes, he created, and oftentimes they were created in addition, so there's more than one of them. That was literally something that could be sold, something to raise money. And the same thing with Brecht's event scores, is that there's something that become a physical, tangible object that have a value, and again, can raise money for more projects. And that's something that's, I think, always, it's always under the surface and doesn't always, oftentimes, it doesn't often get addressed, is that for conceptual artists, that's a challenge, because when you're working in a method, or where you're looking at a medium which is all about idea and not so much about object, and art traditionally is all about objects and value, commercial value of those objects, how do you survive, right? So you've got to figure out that balance. Now, I mentioned both Matthias and Brecht are making references to Duchamp, and specifically in this respect of the boxes, what they're referring to is something that Duchamp made, and he made a series of these that are referred to as boîte en valise. And boîte en valise basically means like a suitcase box. A valise is a kind of a small suitcase, or what we might think of as like a briefcase. That's another way of thinking about it. This inset here is a photograph of Duchamp, and I think it helps give you a better sense of scale. He made several of these between the mid-30s and the early 1940s, so there's about 20 of them. They're roughly the same, although there are some differences one from another. And basically what he did is he kind of, it was like he made a retrospective of his work that was transportable. So you could literally fold it up into this box. And if you look carefully, you see some of his, and again, they're reproductions of some of his early works where he was taking a sign and altering it to where it spelled something different. I think in this photograph you see his famous El Asha'oku, the Mona Lisa image there. There are references to some of his early paintings. This one is the large glass that you see here. It's slightly obscured, but if you look carefully right there, you also see a miniature fountain, which is the urinal piece that's kind of tucked in to a part of it. So the whole thing is designed to unfold. Literally, this looks as if it unfolds outward. It almost looks. When I look at this, it makes me think of like an altarpiece, I think, because I've got too much art history in my head. But it's the way that this is set up. That, the lid of the box lifts open, and you take everything out, and you kind of spread it out. But it's arranged in a way that you see some things vertical and some things horizontally as well. I don't know. What do you think about this? This idea of these little objects and boxes.
I think it's really cool.
Yeah. In what way? Like why good?
You don't necessarily have artists who always make tiny little miniature versions of their larger works.
Yeah. Because it's more tangible in a way, you can literally put your hands on it.
I don't want to say it's cute, but it's cute.
I know, right? I mean, who would normally say Duchamp's work is cute, right? Or even that Fluxus is cute, but maybe some of those things that are cute are also not always, but tend to be kind of precious, So maybe there's a kind of preciousness to them.
This is artwork for pets.
Yeah.
There's almost like a commercial appeal to it as well, though. Like, it's
Yeah.
hey, here's the new Duchamp box. And so it's kind of annoying in that way.
Yeah, I know. And so that's where I think you can bring in a level of criticality to it as well, because it does feel commercial. Like this is Dada is now in a palatable version that you can purchase, or the same thing. Yeah, take one home. Buy one at the Dada store on your way home. Or the same thing with Fluxus too, because it becomes tangible somehow. Maybe it's more palatable. However, at the same time, these are in really small editions. And at least today, anyway, you're only probably going to find them in major museum collections, and some of them might be be owned by collectors.
I mean,
They're
who
not.
would want a journal that's like that big?
I know. Somebody who's really invested in modern art, right? So there is an audience for it, but in the grand scheme of things, that audience is.
You can't have a
It's
large
pretty
journal
small.
piece, but this miniature one is great.
Yeah, I know, right? You can go to the plumbing supply store and get the full scale one if you like for a reduced cost. That's one way to think about this. We talked a little bit sort of around the edges of Yoko Ono. I put these two photographs side by side. This is Yoko Ono and John Lennon, kind of mid-60s on the left, and then a photograph taken more recently. And she's a good example, I think, and one of the things we'll focus on her too is in part to get her out from under that title that she destroyed the Beatles, and to think about her as an artist, but also because she's a Fluxus artist who's been working steadily from the 60s until right now. She's probably somewhere in the world, doing something, working on some project as we speak. I wouldn't be surprised. So it's a good example of how, in some ways, you can talk about Fluxus as having an end, but there are certain artists who are continuing to move Fluxus, move Fluxus forward into our present. So we definitely go outside of because our end point in this class is technically 2000, but she's still alive and working. So I think it's important to go ahead and bring it more or less up to date. One of the things that really probably brought John and Yoko, we think of them as that power couple, to kind of consciousness in a really broad sense in terms of mass culture, was they did two bed-ins in 1969. And basically, what they were doing, they both were really involved in the peace movement. And keep in mind that in the late 1960s, the Vietnam War is really at its peak, and the attitudes toward the war, also kind of public opinions, are also beginning to change as well. So earlier in the 60s, there was a lot of support for it. By the time you get to the later 1960s, people are being, more and more, certainly more and more critical. And so that's certainly American opinion, but we can also see that, globally as well. The other thing about John Lennon and Yoko Ono is they also become kind of international representatives in a lot of ways, because and you think about this, like Yoko Ono is Japanese, but she lives around the world pretty much. She still resides in New York City. John Lennon's clearly originally from Britain, but he's also this kind of global citizen in a way because of this mass popularity. And they lived in New York together, and since then Yoko Ono has continued to live there. So they have an American presence, but they also have really an international or global presence as well. And this in itself is really kind of a new thing in the 1960s. These kind of celebrities, and politicized celebrities who, by face are known just about anywhere that you go in a global context. So here's a case where they did a project which in a lot of ways is really a Fluxus project, although it certainly didn't get talked about that in the popular media because people didn't know about Fluxus so much, at least within that level of media. But they did 2 bed-ins in 1969. One was in a hotel in Amsterdam. The other was in a hotel in Canada. And I can't remember if it was Montreal. It was either Montreal or Toronto, but it was in the city in Canada. And basically what they did was they spent 2 weeks in bed in this hotel, and they had lots of conversations with people, especially with the media. And there is a documentary, if you're interested in this, it's about an hour and a half long or so. They did make a documentary about this, and it's really just kind of chronicling all of these conversations that they had with journalists. And it gives you it's interesting to watch, I think. It gives you a sense of the attitudes and the issues of the time. You also see a lot of very straight-laced journalists trying to figure out what it is that they're doing, and because they don't really get it. And they get into these arguments in some cases when they're trying to talk about peace and the importance of, ending the war and social issues and social disparity. So one of the things in later years, one of the things, I can't remember if it's either John Lennon or Yoko Ono talked about, is they made this comment that they realized at the outset that that a lot of the journalists, when they came to meet them, was expecting that they were like these wild, free love, hippie types, that they were going to be naked and having sex and doing drugs and so on. And what they didn't expect is that they were sitting there in pajamas, they're pretty much clothed from neck, to wrists and ankles and so on, wanting to have some really serious conversations. And they were also using their time on the phone talking to people around the world as well. So what they were doing again is using their celebrityhood to draw attention, to give all of these interviews, basically to promote very particular ideas. What I have on the screen, here's a quote from Yoko Ono that I think is interesting. And this is again something she said in later years. She said, and actually I think this is posted on her website, where you can watch the documentary on YouTube, but it's also on Yoko Ono's website as well. And she says in 1969, John and I were so naive to think that doing the bed-in would help change the world. Well, it might have, but at the time, we didn't know. And I think that's interesting because they're young and have this idea that yes, maybe these conversations that they could have with people could change people's minds. This idea that having a conversation could maybe enact positive change. So again, they're willing to use their celebrity to do that. The work that Yoko Ono did that got the attention of John Lennon and basically the reason why John Lennon wanted to talk to her was this work here, and this is a documentary photograph of the original installation that's since been reinstalled. It's called Ceiling Painting, and basically what it is that there's a canvas that is attached to the ceiling here, so really carefully, and it's a white canvas. It's at the ceiling. There's a chain and a magnifying glass that hangs from the ceiling, and then a step ladder down below. So basically what the work does is it invites you to climb up the ladder and take the magnifying glass, because once you get up on the ladder, you realize that there's text on the canvas, but it really requires a magnifying glass to look at. And when you hold the magnifying glass up, it's just one word, and the word yes. And one of the things that I always have found very powerful about Yoko Ono's work is that it is so positive. She's always looking at the positive. She's certainly critical of very negative things, but she never crosses over into negativity. when, and I love this quote from John Lennon, when he, in later years, when he talked about his experience, this is what he says. He says, it looks like he explains, what happened. He says, it looked like a white canvas with a chain and a spyglass hanging on the end of it. I climbed the ladder, looked through the spyglass, and in tiny little letters it said, yes. So it was positive. I felt relieved. It's a great relief when you get up the ladder and you look through the spyglass and it doesn't say no or fuck you, or something. And I think that's nice because it's a powerful experience, right? And it's also, it's very enigmatic, right? Because yes, what is it about? What is it saying yes to? What is it? And that's in a large part the Fluxus aspect of it, is that it is really open-ended, right? It's you can interpret this. There's this element of chance, certainly. But again, with Yoko Ono, that positive message.
If she had made it today, we know what it would have said.
It would have said peace or imagine, probably.
Sure.
Yeah. She also did these projects which are very similar to the event scores, and most of the original ones were literally just typed onto cards that were placed in a gallery setting. They've also been reproduced in various ways. And they were the whole kind of series they referred to as a painting series, but yet you don't necessarily create paintings. But they're these kind of orchestrated events. So there's the smoke painting, right? So you light canvas or any finished painting with a cigarette at any time for any length of time, see the smoke movement. The painting ends when the whole canvas or painting is gone. There's painting for the wind. Cut a hole in a bag filled with seeds of any kind and place the bag where there is wind. Painting to see the skies. Drill 2 holes in a canvas, hang it where you can see the sky. Change the place of hanging, try both the front and rear windows to see if skies are different. And painting to be stepped on, leave a piece of canvas or finished painting on the floor or in the street. So what's the theme here? What's happening? If you were to do these things, what's happening here?
It's living in the now because anytime you do it, it's going to be different.
Right, so there's always going to be a change, certainly. It's living in the now. I think it's living in the now or living in the present in other ways, too. What else is she getting at here?
Maybe it doesn't take things so seriously, like if you burn the canvas or you walk on the canvas.
Yeah, you've got to let go of it, right? And letting go is so important in a lot of ways. I always feel like there's kind of a Zen, feel, to a lot of these, where you kind of let go of the importance of the object, right? And you've also got, with Yoko Ono, these are pretty early in the 1960s, and certainly there's change that happens over the 60s. But there's, one of the ideas I think that's undermining this is to not be so concerned with objects, right? That objects are something that are transient, and that, in a sense, these are encouraging them to be, to be transient. But those objects, this idea of a painting, is that it gets you to another place, or it gets you to another level of experience, or another level, of understanding. But that only happens, like, the sky, or the painting, eventually plants flowers or something like that. But that only happens if you let go of the objectness or the thinginess. And I say thinginess, and it sounds silly, but there's actually a whole theory of thing or thinginess, and that's complicated. But it's to let go of that thing. And that feels very Zen, kind of Buddhist, in a lot of ways. And that's also, I think, kind of is related to her background. So again, it's conceptual and philosophical in a lot of ways. There's probably one of her best known works that are performative works is Cut Piece. And this was performed in 1965. I'm curious, how many of you have seen Cut Piece? Have some of you seen it? It's only a couple. Okay. Those of you we're going to watch it, so if you've seen it once, you're going to see it again. Most of you haven't seen it, and I think it's important. It's can you handle that, do you think? Have you seen it already? The Cut Piece was a performance that she did in 1965. She's done it since then, but she did it decades later, and so it really kind of altered the meaning in a lot of ways. We won't have time to watch it today, but we'll watch it on Monday. We'll see a more recent video and interview with her when she talks about how that changes and how the meaning of the work changes.